And we're on.
Good morning, everyone. It is Sunday, June 5th, 2022. And this is our first Sunday teaching. So I welcome all of you. I myself have just been participating in a Future of Buddhism conference online that was centered in Garrison, New York. And Anne was just participating in a teaching by Adzom Gyaltse Rinpoche that was centered in Bhutan. So it's quite a world we live in. It's quite a world we live in. And part of what one of the morning presentations was on digital Dharma and how we can connect throughout the world with digital Dharma. And so this is a terrific blessing because I'm seeing everything from England. Astrid, are you in Germany or in Switzerland? Germany? And Brazil, New Mexico, New Hampshire, Houston, Texas, Portland. Yeah, so it's quite a miracle that we can spend a little time together. Hi, Nancy. So typically we would be looking back on what we've been talking about in our Dharma explorations on Sunday mornings to a bit. And what I'm saying, and we'll talk about, certainly relates to that in a large context, but I'm also looking forward to the upcoming present moment, the wonders of the present moment, Dharma explorations that will be starting this coming Tuesday. And we will have Anne Klein, Mark Urowitz, and Dan Gitchell teaching along with myself. Anne is urging me to speak more quickly from the sidelines. So today I want to talk about the present moment and just say a few things about the present moment and how it relates to everything else we are doing. And it's a little bit of a preview and a little bit of, in a way, more at depth of one particular area of the present moment. What I'm drawing from is a book that it's called The Mindful Brain by Daniel Siegel. But another, I don't have the book cover on this, but this is Daniel Stern, The Present Moment, is also inspiring part of what we're presenting. Part of what will be presenting during the course will be inspired by Pema Chodron and her work on Tonglen, and part of it will be inspired by the work of Claire Petit-Manjean and phenomenological inquiry. That's just really, that's from 30,000 feet. But let me talk a little bit about the present moment and why it's so significant. And again, I'm drawing from Daniel Siegel's work here, and particularly if you're interested in finding it, it's pages 114 to 117. In 2005, a neuroscientist named Tse noticed that if he showed a string of images to persons, what happened is if there was an oddball image, their subjective sense of time got expanded. So all the images that kind of fit in with one with another, the sense of time was the same, but if something unusual occurred, there was an expansion of the sense of time. Now, this all has to do with the way the brain works. And, you know, when we talk about brain science, it's a completely different kind of set of metaphors than we meet in traditional Buddhist teachings. But I think there's some helpfulness in shifting out and going into a different set of metaphors and hearing what these scientists are saying. So the outer layer of the brain is called the cortex, and it's got 6 layers. And the outermost layer of that has to do with cognition and familiarity. And the lower layers of the cortex have to do with sort of sensory detailed information. When information comes into us, when we see something, the brain is very, very efficient. And if it's something we have seen before, the upper layers send a message to the lower layers, which basically say, don't pay too much attention. And this is a rose. We've seen roses before, and this is a rose. So we don't have to go into all the details. And we actually then are kind of seeing whatever it is we're seeing through the lens of all the prior roses that we ever saw. So this is interesting because it's a tremendous benefit when we go shopping for us not to get all wrapped up in all the details of the loaf of bread on the shelf as a new experience. What is it? And looking at it and taking in all the granular details. The brain tells us loaf of bread may even be the brand that we're used to. We very efficiently know what it is, we make a decision, and we move on. But part of what can happen if we get really, really into this is that pretty much our life can be a constant state of reunion with the past. Namely, what we're seeing is filtered and experienced as a redo, more or less, of what we've experienced before. I think we all are kind of subliminally aware of that, insofar as we may feel that life may lack a sense of richness or freshness or aliveness. In part, we're being victims of the upper layers of our cortex. At the same time, we all seek newness. We all know that. We go on vacations, we go to new movies, we read new books, we make new acquaintances, we eat new food. We're seeking something that startles us, that gives us a sense of awakening, a newness. But what's interesting in the modern version of that is, we go to something new, but there's a way in which we can't really take it in. We're kind of moving to the next thing before we even really absorb the new thing that we're trying to experience. And so, this thing is kind of the devil embodied in terms of that kind of ultimately almost freneticism of, I want to find something interesting. So we start shopping around and we land on something interesting. And before we know it, our mind says, well, this is not quite as fresh and interesting as I was hoping for. I'm going to go look for something more interesting and more fresh and more new. And so it's almost, we have an almost invariant representation in our minds of what is fresh and what is new. And it keeps pushing us to find yet something else. When we land there, the mind, the upper layers of the mind just don't let us rest. It's like, no, there's something yet different and something new and fresher. And so there's a freneticism that many of us can find ourselves in. I've certainly experienced it in terms of No, another thing, another thing, another thing. It's quite unrestful, quite tensifying, quite stressful. What we do in meditation goes back to that experiment with all the similar images, and then the oddball image. There's a subjective expansion of sense of time. There's also an idea of what's called information density, that our normal way of these upper layers of the cortex, we don't really operate at a high level of information density. Interestingly enough, if we start focusing on our experience as we do in our meditation practice, when we're orienting towards the present moment, and we're orienting towards some kind of sensory experience, let's say our breathing or our bodily sensation, or even it can be what's actually going on in our mind at the moment, but not the content, but the process. We create a shift of focus. We create a shift in focus. And to some extent, all of you have practiced some meditation. I think you've probably all experienced that sometimes it can be feeling like many of us haven't driven shift cars ever, but it's like going from a fifth gear to a first gear. It's like it's when you start to sit sometimes, and let's say you've just come in from a busy day's work, you can feel the speed at which your mind is working and the intensity of that chug-a-chug, 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 chug-a-chug. And it's almost like a rock skipping over the surface of water. Just one thing to the next thing to the next thing. And there is no information density. It's really, we know that whole thing about thought and thinking, it's very unrich in a way. It feels kind of limited. It's all in a kind of narrow band of not a lot of emotion, not a lot of sensation. So we're doing something quite radical when we are meditating, and we're slowing down and we're beginning to pay attention to the present moment. And looking at what that present moment is all about. I've told this story many times, that I heard of the American businessman going to Japan with the CEO. They're a CEO and they're meeting a Japanese CEO, and the Japanese CEO says, "Come see my flowering plum trees." And the CEO goes up to the deck, takes a look at the flowering plum trees and said, "Very nice plum trees." The Japanese CEO wants to sit there and meditate on the flowers and be with the flowers and feel the flowers, perhaps smell the flowers, see the delicate colors of the flowers. Take it all in the moment. They're moving from those higher levels of the cortex into the lower levels of the cortex. There's more information density. They're moving out of invariant representations. I have heard, I don't know Japanese, but I've heard that in Japanese, there are 8 different terms for cherry blossoms. Every stage of the cherry blossom is articulated and valued with its own word. we can very, very easily understand. If all we've got is one word for a cherry blossom and we go and we see that cherry blossom, we have a kind of impoverished experience of cherry blossoms. When we can actually see 8 different stages of the cherry blossom, what richness there is. So one of the things that we're doing when we're meditating is that we're developing a capacity to take in more information, to slow down and enhance the informational density of what we're experiencing, and getting out of the invariant representations of our minds and the expectational biases of our mind into the immediacy of our experience. There are 2 different directions that I'm playing with and going here right now. Let me just sort of give a very, very brief articulation of something that is taught in the Theravada tradition about meditation. That is that if we, let's say we're observing our breathing, we place our attention on the breath, wherever it is, at the nose or throat or the chest or in the belly, the dangchen, the hara, the do in Tibetan. We place our attention on the breath. So first, there's the placing it there. If we can maintain that attention in a continuous manner, that's yet a slightly different function of the mind. The ability to continue our attention. And for those of you who've meditated, you know, we all work with mind chatter and mind distraction, and we can notice that it's a bit different if we actually able to stay with what we have put our focus on. That continuity of attention is a slightly different function of mind. So it's interesting from the Theravada psychology perspective is that if you can place your attention and then sustain it, there's a natural arising of what in the tradition is called pleasurable interest. And that's a very, very interesting state of mind that many of us are aware of, but maybe never had it sort of pointed out. You know, in the Tibetan tradition, we love the phrase pointing out or acknowledging. So where do we see that sense of pleasurable interest in everyday life? Well, some people get fascinated with crossword puzzles or knitting or stamp collecting or chopping celery when they're cooking or straightening the house. But in any of those, when we've placed our attention on something and sustained our attention, there's a pleasurable interest that can arise. What's interesting with meditation, let's say something as meditating on the breathing, I think we all know that the breath is a really pretty neutral object. It's not, most of us when we breathe don't feel that it's inherently interesting. In fact, most of us, if you ask the person on the street, is, you know, if you pay attention to your breath, is that going to be interesting? They'd say, no way, what a boring something. And this may not necessarily occur every 5 minutes you meditate, or if you meditate 10 minutes or 20 minutes, you may not sense this. It certainly, in my experience, has come clearer when I am doing longer periods of meditation. But even when we sit sometimes for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, and especially if we've had some experience, we may notice, that our mind may get a little bit quiet. And all of a sudden, it's just interesting to notice what we're focusing on. And this is a benefit, this is a reward of slowing down, of getting out of invariant representation, and really relishing the moment. So in Japanese culture, it seems, they have many ways of doing this. The tea ceremony where everything is slowed down and you're looking at the cup. They're famous in Japan for, I'm going to forget the name of it now, but there's a very specific Japanese word for when the cup breaks, they use gold to solder the cup together. So then you get these kind of veins and arteries of gold in a kintsugi. That Emily is our Japanese cultural expert. Thank you so much, kintsugi. And so part of the Japanese tea ceremony is to reverently contemplate the gold in the cup that's repaired it. It's the beauty of both the broken and the repaired, and to actually get absorbed in that reflection. Quite a process. It's not kind of our native skill for us as modern Americans, but we can become accustomed to it. When we take this skill of capacity for being in the present moment and have developed it in terms of looking at things from a Buddhist perspective, one of the things that occurs is that normally in the ordinary processes of mind, we really get typically identified with those processes. Get angry, I'm identified with my anger. Get worried, I'm identified with my worry. I get joyous, I'm identified with my joy. I'm thoroughly kind of mixed in with it. But part of what we're cultivating with mindfulness is an ability to be aware of the processes of mind. To see something like anger as a process. To see something as joy as a process. And we can develop the capacity to not be just dragged along by every reactive process of mind, but to be able to experience it, but also have some sense of this is arising and this is ceasing. And within, let's say, the Theravada framework where mindfulness is taught, that perceptive capacity can be developed very, very carefully, and one becomes less and less overtaken by one's reactivities, and one can become more and more free and recognize the impermanent processes, how things are, when they are impermanent, less than ideal, in some ways unsatisfactory, and they're not autonomous. Nothing has got the sense of self that we impute to it. So there's an understanding that develops of everything is a process. The same kind of awareness and mindfulness, when we move it into the Tibetan tradition and get the appropriate instructions and guidance from within the Tibetan system of practice and Dzogchen, this kind of focus can open up into an appreciation of spaciousness and wholeness that is very, very profound and very, very transformative and very, very meaningful to become part of our experience. So focus on the present moment, it has aesthetic aspects to it, hedonic aspects, even if we're just appreciating the cherry blossoms or the taste of our enchilada. It's wonderful. But also has great use, well, psychologically, if we can learn to observe some of our reactivity as opposed to getting swept away with it, great use in our psychological and emotional life, but also in our spiritual life in assisting us to become more sensitive and aware of the dynamism of all life, the interdependence of everything that is occurring, that things are not autonomous and solid as they seem. This kind of awareness can grow with focus. And then, as I say, with the appropriate guidance and practice and things that we teach in our Dzogchen program, there can be an approach to a deeper sense of spaciousness and wholeness that's quite rewarding. So I'm going to leave you with that for now. We're going to switch. Anne is going to lead the meditation at 11 Central Time. At 12, we will have Dharma conversation. And the topic for the conversation this morning will be ways in which we seem to come into the present moment. What's our own experience of coming into the present moment? What supports it? What may be obstacles? We'll just have a opportunity. If there are enough people, there'll be breakout rooms. If there aren't that many people, we'll do it as just a collective conversation from 12 to 12:45. And then at 1, we'll be having a practice of Tara, because we're in the month, the holy month of Sagadawa. So I'm going to take my leave for now, and Anne will be arriving in a minute or two, and we will continue at that point.